Okay, here's the list of representative heroes for today's lecture. We'll still be talking most of the time about things that happened during the reign of Philip II. And the greatest painter of his day in Spain, of course, was El Greco. Although Philip did not, as we'll see, find him to be to his taste in art, two of the greatest saints Spain has produced are also contemporary with Philip. Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit order, which was to have all kinds of influence on European and really world history, education, and art. And Saint Teresa, who was perhaps Philip's favorite author and has remained one of the most popular of all saints right to this day. After the break, we'll hear about the trouble Philip had maintaining control of the Spanish Netherlands, which had been willed to him, as we've seen, by his father. William of Orange, known as William the Silent, will become Philip's most implacable opponent in the Spanish Netherlands. And we'll see the work of the great Flemish painter Peter Bruegel, a man Philip considered to be a Spanish subject, but whose approach to art was certainly different from El Greco's. We'll also hear music during this lecture by Thomas Luis de Victoria, the most important Spanish composer of the day, and Antonio de Cabazon, and others as well. So last week at the end of class, we were just beginning to hear about the career of El Greco in Toledo, and we saw the espolio which he did for the cathedral there, but his real goal was to work here, at the Escorial for Philip II. And in 1580, he sent a picture to Philip, apparently on approval as a sort of resume. The picture in question is the so-called Dream of Philip, although it goes by several other names as well. This is the painting now. It's also sometimes called the Adoration of the Name of Jesus. The monogram of Christ appears at the top, or the allegory of the Holy League. It certainly does have a dream or vision-like quality about it, and Philip is certainly the fellow with the lower center in black, but it is likely, I think, that it was meant to make special reference to the then recent victory of the Holy League that had fought the infidel under Spanish leadership at Lepanto. The fellow to the left of Philip in the yellow robe decorated with ermine tails is thought to be Alvise Mocenigo, the Doge of Venice. The fellow between and above them wearing red gloves is thought to be the Pope Pius V. And the fellow who is looking up to the left of the Pope is thought to be Don Juan, Philip's half-brother, and the overall commander of the Christian fleet. Since Don Juan's body had been brought to the Escorial for burial shortly before this picture was painted, it may have been done specifically to honor him. Last week I mentioned that El Greco had spent quite a bit of time in Venice, and is usually said to owe a lot to his exposure to the work of Tintoretto and Titian. Michelangelo once said that it was a shame that in Venice painters didn't learn to draw well, and this picture certainly wouldn't have changed his mind, given that it's painted from a sort of Venetian perspective. There's no emphasis at all on linear precision. It's very sketchy and freely brushed. It's hard to tell what's going on in some areas in it. It's really surprising to me that Philip liked it. It's really a pretty strange picture, but then Philip liked Hieronymus Bosch too. Within a year or so, Philip commissioned then from El Greco, on the strength of his satisfaction with the picture we just saw, the St. Maurice and the Theban Legion in the Escorial now, and it seemed that El Greco was on his way to getting royal business and the appointment he wanted. He spent 2 years on this work and personally delivered it to the Escorial. As I say, you can still see it there today. Saint Maurice, incidentally, was responsible for the conversion of his Roman legion to Christianity at Thebes in Egypt, and then he and all the members of his legion were massacred later in Switzerland for refusing to take part in pagan sacrifices or some such thing. Maurice, like St. George, St. Michael, was regarded as a patron saint of soldiers. Maurice is the handsome fellow in the center of the group at the right. Philip's nephew, the Duke of Parma, about whom we'll hear more later, appears over Maurice's shoulder, and next to him is Emmanuel Filiberto of Savoy, who was responsible for the Spanish victory at San Quentin, about which we heard last time. He was in fact the Grand Master of the Order of St. Maurice. At the lower left, Maurice appears again consoling his fellow martyrs. Over his shoulder is thought to be a portrait of Don Juan, about whom we also heard last week as the hero of Lepanto. This all looks pretty good, but to El Greco's undoubtedly great disappointment, the king didn't like it. It looks like there would have been some exchange of ideas with the king, or at least with some people on his staff, so that the picture could have been modified in progress to suit the king's taste, but this apparently just didn't happen. The king saw the finished product, didn't like it, and that was that. José Siguenza, the librarian at the Escorial, who often did consult with the king about art, implies that the problem was that the focus of attention was on the elegant figures at the right, not on the actual martyrdom, which was, after all, the key thing from a specifically Christian point of view. El Greco's style has come to be regarded as very much in sync with the temperament of Spanish religion in his day, but Philip himself never commissioned another thing from him. Here you see Toledo from the south across the Rio Tajo. At the right you can see the old Alcázar, though extensively restored since the Spanish Civil War, and the spire of the Cathedral of Toledo in the center. So instead of moving off to the Escorial then, El Greco was to have to stay in Toledo, where his espolio had gotten, of course, a distinctly mixed reception from the cathedral chapter, as we saw last time. Despite these setbacks, however, by 1585 he was getting commissions and establishing himself as at least the most important artist in this city. Probably somewhat later in his career, he painted this view of Toledo in a storm, as it is called, which is one of his most famous pictures. It was apparently never sold and was among the paintings his son inherited after his death. As I mentioned last week, landscape is rarely a dominant feature of Mannerist art like El Greco's, and this is one of only 2 or 3 paintings that can be called landscape out of the 100 or so works attributed to him. It's all the more interesting because it is a pure landscape without any people in it. And such things were still very rare in the 16th century. If not the first pure landscape by a major artist, it's now regarded as the most important one painted to that date. The fact that he kept it with him his whole life may mean just simply that no one was up for buying this kind of subject matter in Spain in the 16th century. Spain was really hardly at the cutting edge of connoisseurship at that time, or maybe it just had a special importance to El Greco himself. That's what I'd like to think. He is, of course, known for his distortion of the human body in the interest, it is usually said, of attaining a more spiritual effect, but here it's the whole world that's distorted. It's difficult to compare this view with the photo we just saw because the vantage point is from the east rather than the south. The Alcázar and the cathedral can be made out clearly enough, but I think the point here is to produce something like a picture of the city that makes the same sort of impact that a picture of a saint would make. It has the same sort of intense, one might say, mystical presence. The treatment of the sky is very important in achieving this effect, and I think Velázquez, who will understand very well the impact weather can have on the personality of a picture, may well have seen this in his formative years. David Davies, an important El Greco scholar, says he thinks that this picture is a hymn to the forces of nature and compares it to the poem La Vida Reiterada by Luis de Leon, the poet professor of Salamanca I mentioned last time. But I think he must have had some other poem in mind. La Vida Reiterada is all about relaxing in a shady garden. And while how spiritual El Greco himself was is debatable, to make him out some sort of romantic pantheist is, I think, even more debatable. So as I was saying a minute ago, although El Greco got no more commissions from the king or the Cathedral of Toledo chapter, although as we'll see he did paint portraits of two archbishops of Toledo, he soon did have a well-established clientele in the city, and in 1586 he got an opportunity which he turned into one of the great accomplishments in the history of art. This is the church of San Tomé, for which he painted the burial of the Conde de Orgaz, the Count of Orgaz. Back in the 14th century, the Conde, or Count, had left an endowment to this church and money to the Augustinian order to build an abbey dedicated to St. Stephen. When the town of Orgaz, which had been committed by the Count to make yearly payments to San Tomé here, stopped them in 1562, a lawsuit resulted which, not surprisingly, took many years to resolve, but which was decided in favor of the church, which then, with its income restored, commissioned El Greco's picture to honor the memory of the benefactor Count. El Greco probably had the inside track to this job because this was also his parish church, and in a bit we'll be seeing his house. This is the picture El Greco painted for the Count's Chapel now, and it's the largest picture he ever painted, at about 15 feet high. At the lower center, we see depicted the miracle which is supposed to have happened on the occasion of the Count's burial, when St. Augustine and St. Stephen appeared to personally lower him into the coffin. Remember, he had left money to the Augustinian order to have an abbey constructed that would be dedicated to St. Stephen, and that did come to pass. Above, we then see his soul in the form of a kind of translucent baby being passed up to the heavenly host. John the Baptist seems to be interceding on his behalf with the Lord, but the Lord directs him to St. Peter, pointedly dangling his keys. This is a pure counter-Reformation statement of Catholic belief. It's St. Peter who stands at the gates, figuratively speaking anyway, and his earthly successors, the popes, have the right that he has to grant or deny admission to paradise. Since St. Augustine and St. Stephen don't bury just anybody, however, the implication is that the Count's character has left little room for doubt about his credentials. I say the saints don't bury just anybody, but nevertheless it seems typical of the atmosphere of 16th century Spain that no one really looks very surprised about what's going on. It's almost as though this could be expected to happen at any funeral, any day. The boy at the lower left is almost certainly Jorge Manuel, El Greco's son. There's a piece of paper in his pocket which reads, in effect, made in 1578. And for a long time this was thought to refer to the date of the picture, but we now know it was painted 8 years later. So what does the date refer to? Apparently to Jorge Manuel, who was made in, that is, born in 1578 and was 8 at the time the picture was painted. The overall organization of the picture is very like the facade of a Greek temple. The people are like the columns, and the clouds of heaven peak above them just like the roof of the Parthenon. Although Crete was under Venetian control when El Greco was born there, he was a Greek speaker and signed his name in Greek throughout his career in Spain. He would certainly have seen a lot of Greek, or at least Greco-Roman temples in his youth. There are probably several portraits of important people in the picture. Two fellows connected with a successful lawsuit are in the right foreground. El Greco's friend Antonio de Covarrubias is at the far left in the line of mourners, and the second man to the right of him is thought to be El Greco himself. We're going to see this in a little more detail now and hear the hymn, parts of which we've been hearing in the background, Triste España, by Juan de la Encina, who was a very important fellow in the arts at the beginning of the 16th century. In Spain, he was a poet and a dramatist. He's often considered the first important Spanish dramatist, and one of Spain's first important composers. This piece was actually written as funeral music for Queen Isabella, but we'll hear it now in commemoration of this other important funeral. This is the place called the Casa del Greco in Toledo, which is more or less where El Greco lived, and which is now the El Greco Museum, although it does not have many original paintings by him. A lot of his pictures were copied many times over by El Greco himself, not to mention others. The fact that El Greco could afford a house with 24 rooms and several servants, including musicians, certainly indicates he had little trouble finding work despite his rejection by the king and the cathedral. He had a sizable library here of 130 books, some of which were on the index, and could count some very important scholars among his friends, although he had no formal education we can document. The fact that he was fluent in Greek was probably an advantage because it was not taught in most schools, despite being the language of the New Testament and the most important ancient philosophical literature. That's St. Peter there, part of the 12 Apostles series by El Greco in the museum. Legend says that he liked to paint here with the blinds closed so as not to disturb the purity of his inner vision. But as I mentioned last week, El Greco was no monk in his private life and had a reputation for trying to wring every last ducat out of his patrons, whether the picture was a portrait or the Assumption of the Virgin. The greatest guitarist in Spain in Philip II's day was Luis de Narvaez, and that's to have quite an honor in a country where everyone played the guitar. He was also the king's guitar teacher, although it's a little hard to imagine Philip sitting around plucking out a folk song on his guitar. And he was also a composer, and we'll hear some of his work now while we see some of the 30 or so portraits El Greco painted, which many prefer to his more emotional religious subjects. This is a portrait of an anonymous subject in the Prado by El Greco. It always reminds me of Castiglione, who says in Il Cortegiano, the Book of the Courtier, the manual for a 16th century gentleman to live by. Castiglione says in there that men should dress like the Spanish in black and white. This is Antonio de Covarrubias in the Louvre. He was a close friend of El Greco and a member of a famous family of scholars and artists. His brother was the Archbishop of Segovia, and their father was an architect. This is Hortensio Felix Paravicino, a Trinitarian monk who became the chaplain of Philip II's son, Philip III. As I mentioned last time, the Trinitarians were involved in getting Cervantes released from his kidnappers in North Africa, and they were committed, in fact, to exchange themselves for prisoners if that would secure their release. They also worked against the slave trade in Africa and were admired for their efforts even by many Protestants. Paravicino was also a poet of sorts and wrote about this, that it's such a good likeness that when he wakes up in the morning, his soul is confused and doesn't know where it's supposed to be, in the body or the picture. He's in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. This fellow used to be identified as Fernando Niño de Guevara, the Grand Inquisitor of Spain, but although he looks the part, he is apparently, in fact, the much more mild-mannered Cardinal Sandoval Rojas, Bernardo Sandoval Rojas, the Archbishop of Toledo, who was a great fan of Don Quixote and is thanked for his support by Cervantes in the book. This is Cardinal Juan Tavera, and if he looks a little ghostly here, that's because the portrait was painted from his death mask. He was, in fact, the predecessor of Bernardo Sandoval Rojas as Archbishop of Toledo, and he was, in fact, a Grand Inquisitor. He also founded, however, the Hospital Tavera or San Juan Bautista, which is now a museum. This is a portrait of Ignatius Loyola by Peter Paul Rubens, who, however, never saw him. The reign of Philip II also included two of the greatest religious figures in the history of the Catholic Church, Loyola here and Saint Teresa. Loyola was a member of a noble family and participated in several military adventures before being badly wounded and turning his attention to spiritual things during his convalescence. His career is somewhat like that of St. Francis, about whom we heard in the Italian Renaissance class. He also was a soldier and pretty much came to his conclusions about religion and what his calling would be while he was convalescing from a wound he'd suffered in battle. Loyola, after his recuperation was complete, attended the University of Salamanca as well as the University of Paris eventually, where he met the future Saint Francis Xavier. After several years of wandering, preaching, and lifestyle experimentation, I guess as it would be called today, during which he was not infrequently in trouble with various authorities, he was given permission by Pope Paul III in 1540 to found a new order, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, of which he was the first general. It seems fitting that the title of the head of this order is general, because it did take on much the personality of a military body in some ways, and the Jesuits have always been regarded as kind of the Marine Corps of the Catholic Church, going off like Francis Xavier did to the Far East. Into Africa the Jesuits went, and into the Americas to spread their faith. This is a bust of Loyola by the man considered the most important sculptor of the day in Spain, Juan Martínez Montañés. The Jesuits were not to be monks in the traditional sense. They do not wear special robes, chant the office, or emphasize withdrawal from the world and meditation. Far from it. Their job is to live in the world and to educate and convert. And they've had great success at this, even in the United States. Many famous colleges and universities are Jesuit, or at least were originally established by the Jesuits, including USF, Santa Clara, Loyola of Chicago, Boston College. Almost any school, of course, with the name Ignatius or Loyola in it is or was at one time connected with the Jesuits. One of their most important scholarly projects has been the production of the Acta Sanctorum, a massive treatment of the lives of the saints still being worked on by the Bollandists in Belgium. As we'll also see, the power of the order eventually came to be resented even in Catholic countries, and it was abolished by Pope Clement XIV in 1773, only to be reestablished in 1814 and go on to become, I think, the largest male religious order today in existence. Well, St. Teresa of Avila was born here in Avila in 1515. The site of her birthplace is now occupied by this church, the Church of La Santa, which the always quotable English architect and writer G.E. Street says just shows what piety can accomplish in the way of bad taste. According to tradition, she was a beautiful and popular teenager, but after recovering from a serious illness and reading the letters of St. Jerome, she entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Avila. It is always more impressive, I think, when someone who really has something to give up becomes a monk or a nun. If you're poor and ugly and powerless, what do you have to lose? You're just not sacrificing as much. Nietzsche's observation that a lot of people are just good because they don't have the strength to do bad is relevant, I think, here. The people who should really be praised for their goodness are those who have the power to do evil and give it up. By parity of reasoning, a nun who is in a position to live anything but a life of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and gives it up is someone who shows real mental strength, as St. Teresa, of course, did her whole life. In this picture, you can see the convent of the Incarnation now in Avila. When she was 18, she entered this convent and spent the next 30 years of her life here. When she was in her 30s, though, she began to have what she took to be visions of a spiritual character, and she also began to question the laxity that had undermined discipline in the convent. This brought her into conflict with the Carmelite order that ran the place and caused her to be considered as well something of a crackpot in the lay community. But she won the support of Pope Pius V and was given permission to found a reformed branch of the order to be known as the Discalced or Shoeless Carmelites, which would return to the ascetic rigor of the Carmelite tradition. Eventually, the leadership of the order, the Carmelite order, became so impressed by her spirituality and what would now probably be called her management skills that she was sent to found branches of the Discalced order elsewhere in Spain. Eventually, some 30 were established in her lifetime. In 1567, she met the man who would come to be known to history as Juan de la Cruz, San Juan de la Cruz, and he founded the first Discalced monastery for men at Duruelo. Like St. Teresa, he was frequently in trouble with authorities of both church and state and probably wrote some of his most famous poetry while he was in jail. Both Juan and St. Teresa are regarded as mystics. Now, although contemporary usage has made the meaning of the term mystic very large, In the context of the history of theology, a mystic is someone who feels he can have direct contact with God. It's obvious why the church has always been suspicious of mystics. In effect, they claim to be able to go over the head of the whole religious bureaucracy straight to the source. The fact that it's difficult to explain the nature of mystical experience makes it, of course, all the more difficult to convince people that one has experienced such a state at all. This is a contemporary portrait of St. Teresa, although I'm sure she didn't pose for it. Here's the way she describes the mystical experience in her autobiography. She says, "Let us now come to consider the soul's sensations in this inward condition. These should be spoken of by those who know them, for as they are beyond understanding, so are they beyond description, essentially. I was wondering when I decided to write this, after taking communion and experiencing that state of prayer of which I am writing, how the soul is occupied at the time. Then the Lord said to me, 'It dissolves utterly, my daughter, to rest more and more in me. It is no longer itself that lives, it is I.' Anyone who has experienced this state will to some extent understand. It cannot be expressed more clearly, since all that happens is so obscure. I can only say that the soul conceives itself to be near God, and that it is left with such a conviction that it cannot possibly help believing. If it understands, it does not understand how it understands, or at least cannot comprehend anything of what it understands. I do not think it understands at all, because, as I have said, it does not understand itself, nor can I myself understand this." Well, you can see why she had difficulty convincing the authorities she'd had such an experience at all. Philip II himself was very impressed by St. Teresa, interviewed her, and on at least one occasion got her out of a jam with the church administration. He kept her books in a spatial cabinet in the Escorial Library, to which only he had the key, and the library now owns the handwritten autographs of several of her books. In 1970, she became the first woman in history to be given the title Doctor Ecclesiae, Doctor of the Church, and she is certainly entitled to be called a great religious writer. But no one can read some passages in her work without doing a bit of a double take. The same is true of the poetry of Juan de la Cruz, and they have both been subjected to a great deal of literary psychoanalysis over the years. Will Durant says he thinks her visions were the product of hysteroepilepsy brought on by sexual repression. That just sounds funny in this post-Freudian era, but she does leave herself open to that kind of talk. Later this quarter, we'll see Bernini's famous St. Teresa in Ecstasy in Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome, which attempts to make visible one of her most famous and most analyzed visions. I think if any great painter has the right to be called mystical on the basis of his work, it's probably El Greco. This is his Assumption of the Virgin now in the Santa Cruz Museum in Toledo. In the eyes of most critics, the distorted, elongated figures in his pictures help create a mystical or at least spiritual atmosphere in his art. In fact, ever since the Middle Ages, the saints have often been represented in paintings or sculpture as inordinately long-limbed. It's certainly rare to see a fat saint, at least. Early in the 20th century, the theory that he painted the way he did because he had something wrong with his eyes was very popular. But trying to infer anything about an artist's character or anatomy from what he creates can lead you to some pretty silly conclusions. What are we supposed to think Jackson Pollock's eyes were like? On the basis of this theory, if he had a driver's license, it should have been taken away from him, that's for sure. In fact, El Greco himself says Michelangelo told him that this sort of distortion contributes to a mystical, a spiritual effect. We're going to see some more of El Greco's pictures now and hear some more of the music of Thomas Luis de Victoria, which you've been hearing in the background. He is usually considered the greatest Spanish composer of the 16th century, at least. It's interesting that, like St. Teresa, he was born in Avila. Then, after spending most of his career in Rome, he returned to be the organist at the Carmelite convent in Madrid. So it's not surprising, maybe, that his music should seem to fit well with the spirit of St. Teresa and El Greco. We're going to hear the Gloria from his Missa O Magnum Mysterium. This is St. Francis in the San Francisco Palace of the Legion of Honor. To the right of the Virgin here, this is thought to be a self-portrait of El Greco. So we're back in the Escorial now, and this is a suit of armor which was made for Philip, although he never wore it in battle. In 1588, of course, he sent the Armada to attack England after the death of Mary Stuart made it clear that if England were to be restored to the Catholic faith, Philip would have to do it himself. Here's another suit of armor made for him in the Escorial Armory. As we heard last quarter, the Armada was virtually wiped out in about as one-sided a major battle as has ever been fought. The Spanish lost about 70 ships and close to 20,000 men. The English lost no ships and probably fewer than 100 men in the actual fighting. Despite his grandiose plans for world domination by Spain and the Catholic Church, he lived very simply himself. He dressed no differently than any ordinary palace official, and it is said that people often walked right by him without realizing he was the King of Spain at all. If they had looked closely, though, they would have noticed he was always wearing the insignia of the Order of the Golden Fleece, which was established by his great-great-great-grandfather, Philip the Good, the Duke of Burgundy, as we heard last quarter, and by Philip's day it had become the Habsburg symbol. His private life was amazingly moral for a man in his position, and he apparently had no mistresses or gossip-arousing affairs so common in other courts. This is his throne room in the Escorial, which is about as plain as throne rooms can get. We're going to see some more of Philip's own part of the Escorial now, and hear a harpsichord piece by Antonio de Cabazon, the blind organist at the Escorial, some of whose music we heard last time. This is the wonderful door into the throne room from the antechamber. the antechamber where ambassadors and other visitors waited to see His Majesty, and that's the door you see there in the distance. In this room you can see the sort of sedan chair in which he was wont to be carried all the way from Madrid to the palace. This is the bedroom of his favorite child, his daughter Isabella Clara Eugenia, about whom we'll hear a lot in the future, because at his death, Philip willed her what was left of the Spanish Netherlands. And this is his own bedroom, where he was to die in 1598. This picture of Philip by Juan Pantoja de la Cruz is thought to be the last portrait of Philip, whose reign started off so promising and ended with so many of his hopes unfulfilled. England was not going to be ruled by a Catholic. Half the Spanish Netherlands will have been lost to the Dutch by the time he dies. And his own son, the soon-to-be Philip III, was clearly not turning out to be a man likely to change these things. Not a man likely to win any great victories of either military or political sort. This is a portrait now of Philip III by Juan Pantoja de la Cruz again, and he did succeed his father Philip in 1598. He's usually considered to have been pretty much just sort of like putty in the hands of the Duke of Lerma, though, who doesn't get very high marks from historians. It should be noticed, however, that Lerma, with the king's approval, arranged a peace treaty with James I of England and also signed off on the 12-year truce, which the king's sister Isabella Clara Eugenia had been instrumental in arranging between the Spanish Netherlands and Holland, or what was by this time left of the Spanish Netherlands and Holland, in 1609. Less praiseworthy was Lerma's decision, also reached in 1609, to expel the Moriscos, the descendants of those who had superficially converted to Christianity after the fall of Granada, the Muslims who had superficially converted. Lerma and his family, to their great profit, sold most of the property confiscated from the ones who were banished, the Moriscos, many of whom were then killed in North Africa because they were regarded as insincere converts back to Islam. When Philip III died, he left the throne to his son Philip IV, who will become, as we'll see later this quarter, the patron and best friend of the next great painter in the history of Spanish art, Diego Rodriguez de Silva y Velázquez, and we'll be back in a few weeks to hear about them. But we'll wind up this stay in Spain now with another organ piece by Antonio de Cabazon, and in doing so take a short tour of the Church of San Lorenzo, the real centerpiece of El Escorial, and where Philip III and his father Philip II and his father Charles V are all buried, and Philip IV buried here too, as we'll see. So this is the interior of San Lorenzo in El Escorial now, looking from west to east. And again, the organist we're going to hear is Paulino Ortiz, who is, or was at the time of this recording, the organist at El Escorial. This is the organ up closer. Here you can see the east end of the church with the orants of Philip, 3 of his 4 wives, Mary Tudor is the one who's absent, and his firstborn son, Don Carlos, somewhat surprisingly present considering their relationship. Here you can see the coffins in the crypt beneath the east end of the church. And here's one last view of the Escorial. We'll go on from there after the break.